So the elephant in that space is obviously polarization. It has become a key issue. We see it as practitioners at democracy on the ground in different contexts, with increasing stridency in many debates, with people identifying with their issues and therefore seeing the other opinions as not just contradictory opinions, but different sets of people that can't get along, with increasing tension, less and less willingness to come together, etc. So a huge major concern. Now, can safe spaces such as the one that Verena and Kara will tell us about tonight be a remedy? To what extent, etc.? There's a quote that comes to mind when, for me, in relation to this. As a consultant practitioner, I often ask myself to what extent we have managed to get participants to actually foster greater listening, greater collective intelligence. And sometimes I see many processes that are, somewhat going through the motions. My colleague Pauline in the room will have in mind this recent, very antagonistic and very conflictual process we had in a municipality in Brussels, with people almost coming to hands and fighting. So our collective intelligence processes need to become more collectively intelligent. And again, how do we do that? So maybe just as a very quick warm-up, I'd like to share something that I like sharing with my students on this matter, which is the etymology of a number of words that we'll be using tonight. And I will turn to my colleague Elise, because I see some people in the waiting room and I'm struggling to maintain both my attention on both sides.
Yeah, I'm admitting them as we.
Okay, cool. Good. So I didn't need to do that.
Yeah, we're 25 now, and more people are coming in.
I should have known that you were on the case. So we're seeking dialogue, right? But what we often have is debate, sometimes at best a conversation. And what we're also seeking often is more than dialogue, is a deliberation. Now, I often see our interlocutors, different stakeholders, mixing up these notions. So dialogue comes from Greek, it's dia, going through, and logos, the verb. And the underlying notion is that we want people to be in a state whereby the opinion of the other will go through your opinion or our opinion and change it. That's the underlying notion behind dialogue. What we often have is debate, and I love the etymology of this word because it's from the Latin word battere, forgive my Latin accent, which means hit, and more specifically, hit around the head. So it's really about, slapping, if you want to exaggerate the sense, it's really slapping the other about, your ideas, and that's not what we necessarily want in a safe space. What we want to some extent is a bit also of conversation, because interestingly, the notion behind conversation, conversatio in Latin, is the very social aspect of being together, coming together, and sharing a moment. In Latin, the word comes from being with, frequenting, spending time with. So we want the qualities of a conversation with the qualities of a dialogue, I guess. But to some extent, I would suggest that we also want a share of debate, because we want to beat around the arguments and get something else. And that's the intention behind deliberation, which from the Latin word means to weigh, to think carefully, to examine. And it is, if you look at it, a combination of debate and dialogue. You're not just there to exchange opinions and maybe change your opinion. You're also there to weigh and consider and have a battle of arguments to see, perhaps in your mind, which is the strongest. So with this in mind, it's not just because we put people together, as George Bernard Shaw said, that there will be a proper conversation, dialogue, deliberation, or whatever we're seeking to do. Now, very quick word in terms of what we're trying to do at Smarter Together and Democracy is produce, foster collective intelligence, which is possible. And our belief is that we have in the political realm witnessed recently a wave, as the OECD called it, of deliberative practices, where there is deliberation that's being fostered, taking the shape, for instance, of citizens' assemblies. And what we're witnessing and keen to demonstrate is that there are many more ways to bring together not just citizens, but also different types of stakeholders for different purposes. So actually, great news. We published this manual. If you haven't heard of it already, I want to make sure you know about it because it's open access and you can find it on the Smarter Together website, to which Verena and Chiara contributed a wonderful chapter, which we'll be saying more about today. And who's behind this? Well, a nonprofit, Smarter Together, and a consultancy. But that's enough. Let's dive into it. We'll have a presentation from Verena and Chiara about these famous safe spaces. Then we'll go into two groups with Verena and Chiara, so we can exchange very informally and have the conversation aspect I was referring to. And then we'll get back together to share some insights, takeaways, and what's coming up next. Now, indeed, we're ready to dive into the topic with Verena. Verena, your turn, your presentation.
Thank you so much, Stephen, and hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I'm based in Innsbruck, Austria. I recently founded my very own NGO to tackle the very complex problems that we face along the road to net zero in Europe now. What I wanted to share with you today is how we started to really dive into this methodology when I started my job at Stiftung Mercator in Essen in Germany in 2013, building the Europe project portfolio of this private foundation. And as Stephen already said, this was a time when we still had the ripple effects and the ramifications of the Eurozone crisis. And we had big problems and emotions really running high between especially Greece and Germany. We had all these emergency council meetings that you might remember. And I asked myself, well, what could be the most effective, the most efficient, but also the most sort of satisfying intervention to now do if I only had, let's say, a laser point or an acupuncture kind of methodology at hand. And having worked in journalism before that, I did what I knew best, and that was really picking up the phone and at that time calling up different members of parliament, both in Athens but also in Berlin, because on both sides, suddenly these national lawmakers had to decide about millions of euros, even billions of euros every day in their own democracies. And this was the moment when I realized that we want and we need thousands of politicians, but also diplomats and administrators and staff really to work together every day in the European Union, because it's designed like that. It's built as a cooperation space in governance. And if we want to enable all these thousands of people to really fulfill this kind of cooperation exercise, we need to equip them and service them with the opportunity to really get in contact with each other and to gain more understanding of each other and to ultimately maybe cooperate better or sooner, whatever the issue is. Now, you might say, well, but we have European institutions to do that, and that is right. We have the European Commission, we have the European Parliament, we have the European Council that are these sort of embodied places of cooperation in Brussels. But what we usually don't think of is that there is a kind of hinterland in the political leadership space where we don't have these formats for meetings and for cooperation built in, i.e., there are about 10,000 lawmakers in our different national parliaments as we speak. And for them, we haven't found a single official European budget, or a program or a project money. But the only way to design something for them where they have the ability to get to know each other, listen to each other, and meet each other would be in that moment by a private intervention through our foundation in Germany. And in this case, I basically assembled the methods that I had learned in journalism, as I already said, where you have that reflex, to immediately put yourself to the field, to immediately ask people questions on what's going on in their theme, in their village, in their constituency. But the other trove of methods that I had already sort of in my backpack by then was really the toolbox of European diplomacy. Because I have had the chance to work in the Balkans for 3 years in a diplomatic team, and I had been so fascinated that whenever to a layperson like me, something seemed to be in a deadlock or a dead end, and trust would seem to be, empty between, let's say, the leaders of two capitals, then the very skilled diplomat, of course, comes in and says, okay, we need to convene the decision makers and the multipliers of both parties in a safe space, or as they call it, a back channel, or they call it a technical convening channel, or whatever have you. And that's when I understood how amazingly effective and impactful it is when you create this second strand among and for a certain sort of group of people or parties, and you manage, in the best case, to get one step ahead of the curve in the timeline, in the safe space. So you build the trust in the safe space, while at the same time, you basically enable the disagreement to continue in the public fray or in the open and media space. So there's also a smart idea about this second channel that, of course, can mitigate and prevent a lot of escalation and enhance the quality of any given sort of format just because it's there. So the two disagreeing parties would still go on TV the next day, maybe, and also officially and loudly disagree. But at the same time, I'm sure all of you know this, like there would be something very different to the quality of their disagreement when they have met in a safe space the night before, and when they have had the opportunity to sit together in a room as humans and not just with their official sort of don as a politician or public leader.
Verena, what you're saying reminds me of this book that I found very inspiring from Cass Sunstein, Why Societies Need Dissent. And he comes from the legal world. And in a jury, if you don't have someone questioning and voicing their disagreement, you don't have the emergence of collective intelligence. You don't have better decisions because you can have groupthink. So what we're navigating here is a tension between providing a space to vent people's disagreements or participants' disagreements, as well as coming together. So we find the tension that I see in the etymology of the word deliberation between an element of dialogue and respect and listening, but also an element of fighting over the facts and the different opinions, etc. So what are the methodologies that you have developed or that you tapped into from your days as a diplomat or from other fields that allow participants like the ones like policymakers to do that, to navigate these two tensions?
Yeah, in the pilot of what is today called the Open European Dialogue, in the first pilot meeting, I decided to basically knit in or weave in the two main methods that I had just explored. So one was from journalism, so to really design any project or process in a human-centered way and in a demand-based way, to first listen to what people really need when they are ready to travel, if they have any funds, if they have any restrictions, and so on. So you really want to understand from your possible sort of constituency first how you best develop a certain process. And the second method I wanted to bring into this kind of dialogue was what I just mentioned from diplomacy, the back channel or the safe space setting, not just to bring a space and a place to what you call the dialogue and the deliberation, but at the same time to maybe get to the notion that if there is cognitive, social, and emotional intelligence individually, then also when we talk about collective intelligence, we will or are invited to think about the three notions. So there's also something like a collective emotional intelligence, and that is something you can only sort of start sensing when you bring people together in an analog setting, and when they can approach each other as human beings without, their cards in front of them, and without the next sort of press conference looming in half an hour. And so one of the methods that I tapped into was from partner counseling or, psychology, and from also group counseling, and it's called Imago therapy or the Imago technique. So when we first invited members of parliament from these two countries, but also some other countries, when we first invited them to Berlin, we used the idea of Imago in that meeting. And this means the following. Like, on the one hand, the key rule in Imago as a sort of communication technique is that only one party speaks at a time. And the second idea is that you always have a speaker or a sender of information, but then you also have a receiver on the other side or on the other hand. And the key role is with the receiver in this case. Why? Because the receiver in Imago takes 3 steps. Like, after the first, sentences or statement from the sender, the receiver mirrors the sender. So he or she would say, okay, I got it. I think you said this or that. Or, so you are saying this or that. And if you want to ask more, then you say, well, and tell me more. Is there more to it? This is the step 1, the mirror. Then the second step is the validation. So that would mean that when you have heard the statement of the sender, the receiver says, well, this makes sense to me because of this or that. and I can see, where you're coming from, but maybe help me understand on that particular issue, help me understand more. And then comes number 3, the last step in Imago, and that is called the empathy. So this is really key, because in the politician's case, it's the only sort of moment where, feelings and emotions find their proper space. Because in the empathy moment, you say, as the receiver of the statement, oh, I can imagine you might be feeling frustrated that we didn't pass this policy, or that we didn't pass the bill, or I can imagine you might be feeling really angry at us or our government. So while all this sounds in a way maybe soft or maybe even banal, we have to think that there is no proper sort of other space and place in our European policy world where people can have these kinds of encounters.
Wonderful. Thank you, Verena. And maybe I could turn to Chiara, who is at the moment still managing the Open European Dialogue. It's still going on. And building on what Verena said in her introduction, in terms of methodologies, what you can achieve in such a space or not achieve, mm-hmm. Very curious to have your testimony also.
Hello, everyone. And allow me to take just a little detour before we get to Stephen's question. And Stephen, if I don't get to it, just sign to me and remind me to get to that specific part. But I just did want to share something that might be obvious, but for me, it's just important in terms of the framing of our conversation, is that we're all here because, as Stephen said, we have this challenge of polarization. And so when Stephen asked me to think about, key principles, takeaways, insights, the number one principle, I believe, behind the Open European Dialogue is the recognition that dialogue is the key element for us to overcome polarization. And I'll be even a bit more sort of provocative, maybe for some, but maybe polarization is not in and of itself the absolute enemy. But the issue is, what is the challenge that this poses to keeping together a functioning society if we're just not able to agree with each other? Well, that would be nice, but, even speak to each other sometimes, right? And that's where the intuition that Verena spoke about earlier came into play, right? We need to create spaces where this is possible. So the first sort of principle is there shan't be any progress on the issue of polarization if we're not constantly training and putting at the center dialogue. And dialogue intended for me, for us at Apropos, which I'll introduce in a moment, intended as the ability to exist in discomfort and not disengage when you are confronted with an opinion that you don't agree with. And I do believe that we're all observing in society that we're just getting weaker at that. And we can explore maybe in a different webinar the reasons. But again, we need to create spaces that can counter this trend and can help us train our dialogue muscle. It's a muscle, right? It's about how often are we able to be confronted with people who we don't agree with and remain engaged, remain empathetic. So that was my first sort of little detour. And then something else, again, building upon things that have already been said, this is the second principle. And this is where I think I believe most strongly in the work that the Open European Dialogue has done up until now, and that is now continuing in Apropos. And it's that it doesn't just happen, right? We cannot just put people in a room, we saw it in the introductory slide, and assume that dialogue has happened. It doesn't happen, right? And other sectors, I feel like, are way more in tune with the needs of designing spaces, creating environmental nudges that can encourage certain types of behavior above others. And we mentioned, for example, was mentioned earlier by Verena again, that there might not be sort of the appropriate spaces for national members of parliament in Europe to have dialogue, but I will say something. There is an institutional mechanism there that's called COSAC, one of those acronyms that I can't quite translate on the spot because it's in French, where the delegations from national parliaments get together twice a year in Brussels and for 2 days are engaging in the arena for political dialogue for national parliaments. But what this then looks like on the inside is a set of 1.5 minute statements that are followed one after the other. There's 10 before you get even to a Q&A. This happens over and over again in different sessions, and then you go home. So this is why I wanted to use this example, is to bring us back to where I think the number one methodological contribution that I would like to make to this conversation is, we need to design spaces that are fit for purpose, that have the intentionality built into it to be able to achieve what they say they want to do, right? So let's see a little bit more. So that's why we founded Apropos. It's a new think tank that is specializing in process design for politics, somewhat of a field that we're trying to sort of launch and put at the center of conversation. And it's the idea that you can create spaces that lead to better dialogue and all of the great things we want to lead to, but they need to be designed with intentionality, right? I want to give an example, and then I'll see if this is where we want to take that conversation. But for example, we know by now so much from cognitive and behavioral sciences about the degree to which we wildly overestimate our rationality in making decisions. And we have a tendency to think this is not the case when it comes to important decisions, such as political, but it is, in fact, even more so the case because we have a lot to lose when it comes to issues that touch us deeply in terms of values and whatnot. And we are still, even though we are, and we have known this for decades now, we are still designing dialogue spaces, policy-making spaces, where we assume that just confronting people with new information will change their minds or change the outcome. And this is not the case. So I think that what we're looking at is the need to sort of codify an intentional mechanism that can then use different types of strategies like the imagotherapy that Verena mentioned, but the codification of an overall approach to the way that we create design spaces that is intentional and that is based, yes, on user-centric methods, design thinking, absolutely. I would go one step ahead and say not only design thinking, but again, human-centric, which means working with the reality of how people's minds work and not against them. And yes, I'm talking about panels that go on for hours. No? How can the human brain be asked to consume all this information? So as we'll see maybe in a minute or so, this then boils down to very small details. But beyond that, it is about also applying purpose-driven strategic thinking to these spaces. What do we want them to do? Are they there to create trust? Then they need to be designed in a certain way. If they're there to create a specific other outcome, they need a different process. And that's where also procedural thinking is important, which means just the practice of asking ourselves, like, how do we get from A to B? What are the logical steps that are necessary? And here I'll quote something that Verena told me in my early days when I picked up as head of the Open European Dialogue, which is so many of us that are invested in change only are interested in looking at step 9 and 10 to get to where we want to go. And what we have also internalized with the Open European Dialogue and with Apropos is you need to first build steps 1 to 8. So the preconditions to allow us then to move on to potentially political compromise. But if we're not putting in those first steps and we're not thinking about how we create those steps, then there's a bit of a flawed system. Steven, I'm sure I went off topic.
No. But it feels like I would benefit from specific, concrete insights into how though this preparation takes place and how you design according to the purpose. Is this a good time to share your slide on the 3Ps framework?
Yes, I think I would share the one which is specific to trust building so that I can use it to give some examples from the Open European Dialogue.
Okay, there you go. Fresh from my computer.
Wonderful. So at the Open European Dialogue, we decided that trust building was going to be the key element that we needed to design for. And with Apropos, what we've done is we've tried to put all of this learning after 8+ years working with policymakers into a sort of simplified framework that we now call the 3Ps. And it's this people, purpose, process. And we are always asking ourselves, like, are these three aligned? For example, when we speak about people, do you know who you're designing for? And I think Verena said this very well with concrete examples. And what do they want? What are their needs? And that's sort of the base of design thinking. But then you move on to purpose and you need to think, what is the ideal outcome of this space that I'm designing? And take that again one step further. For whom is this an ideal outcome? Because it's not said that it is the same for everyone. And then finally, which is where we come to the procedural logic that I was mentioning, how do I then get those people that I have in the room, not others, right? This is about engaging the people you are able to engage. How do I get them through a process? Now, what are the logical steps that can help them get to the stated purpose that we apparently share? And what's interesting is if you start using these 3Ps and thinking to yourself whether there's alignment or not, you can see where there's space maybe for improvement. And in terms of the trust building spaces that we have been creating with the Open European Dialogue, again, empathy is very evident. For example, that's one of the questions we might get is why are these dialogues only between policymakers and do not include citizens? And to us, that is a form of showing also empathy towards the role and responsibilities and challenges that it is to be a policymaker and designing a space where they feel like someone has understood their also needs, right? And is designing for them. And in turn, that creates a space that can also breed empathy for others. But first, they need to feel it themselves. Purpose, for example, there's an issue here. Often, many of these new initiatives that want to bring together people from different political views or whatnot, they claim to want to create a trust-building exercise. But really what they're trying to do is take one side and convince them that we're the good ones, And so there's an issue of authenticity, right? So at some point, people will start to latch on to the fact that you say you're creating an open space where people can express themselves, but actually you're trying to beat them around the head. And that's not going to play well. And finally, process competence. I think that's also quite evident. It's the idea of, do you have a process in place that can create trust in what you've designed because it's logical, because it, has the correct timings. For example, how many dialogues or spaces do we go to where we say we are going to solve climate change now in 2.5 hours, right? Like that is not by design a space that will allow me to feel trust towards the space, because I might think it's a little bit of a joke because it's never going to happen. And so outside you see these the three elements that we considered, which when we researched we found most compelling for trust building, which are empathy, authenticity, and competence. And as I said, just a few examples of how we have tried to use this logic for the Open European Dialogue. But I'll get to tiny examples because this is all very still in the air. If we want MPs to talk to other MPs who they wouldn't necessarily share a room with, let alone a conversation, we need to think through, and I think we can get maybe rid of the slide. I think we need to think through, what are the steps that they're going to go to get to this table conversation, and how can we incentivize a certain behavior above another? For example, we refuse to provide them with lists of participants ahead of time. we get a lot of pushback from the offices. But what happens if you do provide them is people will already scan the faces of the people they want to talk to. They will have made their opinions about sort of the people they don't want to talk to, and that's already creating a further barrier. So we remove that. Name tags have their first name and their country, no party, because again, this is about creating a space where we are nudging them or reminding them that they are here as humans, not as representatives. They are here to experience a dialogue as people first, which is again putting the human back into the political environment. Let's remember that we are ruled not by robots, but by people. And sometimes we expect these people to react in ways that are not quite human, if you see what I mean. We expect them to do a lot of more things than we think is possible. We ask them, like Verena said, to get together in small groups to share their own challenges about their political career. When did they start? How? So reconnecting them to a potential common ground that can then fuel the rest of the discussion. So there's very many different ways, and there's books and books of different facilitation techniques. For us, it's always though about what's the purpose. And once you've defined that, you can create a process that is coherent with that.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kara. So much content there. I assume there are lots of questions, and I have some, but I will hand over to anyone who wants to ask questions from the audience to Verena and Kara. Don't hesitate to open your mic and go ahead. Elise.
Yes, thank you, Stephen. Maybe I'm cheating a bit because I also am with Smarter Together, but I will nevertheless ask my question. Thank you so much, Verena and Chiara, for presenting the case of the Open European Dialogue. I think it's very interesting because I actually I read the case study from the handbook, and I encouraged the other participants to do so, because we learned a lot on also what inspired you to build this method in that way. But my question was regarding the already existing European mechanism and institutions for such a result. More specifically, the COSAC, so the parliamentary committees for national parliaments. From the handbook, you suggest that it was not working so well. And one of the questions I wanted to ask is, do you see like the Open European Dialogue as a necessary political integration for the EU, so part of the political integration process, part of the European project? And did you have any coordination or feedback with COSAC on that project? Thank you.
Yeah, I think I'll take that one. I think the answer arrives on two levels. One is we need to upgrade the design of existing institutions to create a higher chance at the outcomes that we want. And specifically this I'm very passionate about, if these are dialogue fora, where the objective is dialogue, we need to design dialogue spaces, right? Not statement spaces. We can have fantastic emails or other methods to share statements. So that's one thing. And it's not about replacing or integrating. It really is about creating more value through more intentional design of institutional spaces. The other flip side is I believe that informal spaces, safe spaces, somewhat by definition have to outside of the rigidities of institutional structures. You need both, right? I think and then I'll pass it over to Verena because she might have a different perspective, but I think a lot of the power of what Verena was describing is the power of informal networks and relationships. And we've heard this firsthand in the OE, people who have come to our spaces and report using 80% of the contact for the rest of their career, right? That's incredible. But by definition, these need to be informal spaces. They are other than. One of the tips I did not share, it'll be the last, is in the Open European Dialogue, we refuse to have recommendations at the end of the dialogue. Why? Because by taking problem solving off the table by taking negotiating off the table, we allow these politicians to listen to one another and engage in a different kind of conversation.
Very helpful. I see Woody Campbell has raised his hand. Maybe let's take your comment or question, Woody, and then Verena, you can combine your remarks, perhaps. Woody, and maybe introduce yourself. Tell us where you're from. And
well, yeah, hi. I'm a democracy reform activist from DC, I found this event on Eventbrite, and it sounded very interesting. I appreciated both your presentations. I was curious about whether in any of these safe dialogues there's ever been an exercise of I don't know, some kind of simulation where you put yourself in, I don't know, the other legislators' shoe or the other MPs' shoes, and try to understand, okay, here are all my constraints, and here is how I would, and then the other person would kind of think, okay, if I was in their position and under these kind of pressures, what would I do?
Reminds me of the empathy map in design thinking. Do you use that sort of approach, Verena or Chiara?
Thank you, Woody. Well, I can just speak for the first years, and there we had enough on our plate, actually, bringing the authentic self of, at that time, up to 28 EU member states into one room. So we didn't have to go to that next dimension and bring them again in a new role, because as we said before, we invited them, for example, to approach Hungary with a completely new sort of entry point through the Imago steps that I just mentioned before. So there were certain sort of country posters in the first meeting where we always made sure that we had no more than 50 people in the room. And I'm pretty sure you stick with this sort of more or less useful number, Chiara, to make sure that there is a chance to also get rid of your biases, a lot of them unconscious, some of them conscious biases, when thinking of one country of the EU and associating immediately a certain, list of attributes that we wanted to get rid of. So in that first meeting, it was really neat because we collected very, very counterintuitive and different kinds of stats from each country. And so, in some of these elements, Hungary was really first in class. And so this already allows you to walk in there and debunk your conventional wisdom or your conventional sort of image that you have related to a certain party or a certain country. And I think this sort of shedding of all these notions, also as Chiara said, like no last names, no party affiliation, it all helps to approach things. And this is the old Greek word now, with the idiot's eye, and the idiot is the one who sees, and sees with a fresh sort of eye. And that's what is the point of that kind of space.
Being half American myself, I would love to see an open European dialogue on the US side with, policymakers from different parts of the US talking without, polarizing. Chiara, in terms of building empathy, putting oneself in somebody else's shoes, etc., do you try and foster that type of approach?
Yes, but I agree with Verena. So Woody, it's been something we thought about, the simulation, and I wouldn't exclude doing it, but it's true that there is just so much material already that sometimes we're looking for like the very strange or different thing, and it really just is about very tiny things that we can do. And sort of one of the ways, and I think especially when you're working with sort of more high level politicians, we often sort of the world that we have come from, which is sort of the facilitation and process design, it gets sometimes a bad rep in terms of like, we're the post-it people, we're the people with the icebreakers. And to be frank, personally, we try to stay very much away from that approach. Like everything has to have a specific takeaway. And there is so much that you can do with the human material that's already there. And I believe that when you're working with an audience that is somewhat difficult or used to being approached with a certain level of reverence, no, or referential, we know that you're the most important person in the room, trying to sort of limit the gimmicks in favor of just really putting the two people and asking them, what is it that is difficult about your job? That is way more of an instant bonding moment because it's real. It's reality. It's not concocted through an exercise. I don't know if I'm like, if that helps at all, but it's really the idea of like, let's do the least amount of gimmick necessary to get you to where you want to go, rather than try like new methods.
No, that seems like
I don't know if that's
perspective. Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, and I appreciate your responses. Thank you both.
So if we want to keep to our promise of keeping this short and punchy and have regular insights into different chapters of the handbook and different methodologies, we have space for some very brief questions and replies. Elise and Camille, I saw you had your hands raised. Elise, go first.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. I was wondering. So two short questions for me. If an organization was to reproduce this, to follow this model, to follow the same approach, which advice would you give them? Like, what would be the main advice? So that's my first question. And the second question would be, what role do you give, if there is any, to experts within this setting of safe space?
And maybe let's
take one more. Sorry.
Yeah, if there are other questions, Camille or anyone else, and then we can.
Elise guessed exactly what I was going to say. I was going to say, can you give us practical tips to reproduce? And that was the first question. So 2 in 1.
All the best.
I mean, for main advice, I think me and Verena are going to have to ping pong because that's a hard question. And I do believe that the application of this method that I call sort of political process design is about the act of creating tailor-made spaces that are fit for purpose. So it really is about engaging in a intentional process of working through the steps of, as I said, the 3 Ps, like, who am I trying to serve? Why? What do they need? What do they expect out of it? How does that overlap with what I need? So I don't want to give sort of quick fix answers, and maybe here it's just I'm not being very, very user friendly, but it really is about like, can we slow down and just think through the process of what is it that you want to achieve, and how does the human element work into that? I think already that would make a big difference. Sort of how is the human if I were a human going through this process, how would I feel? Right? It's like, that's the brilliance of this work, is that thankfully we're all humans, so we can test these ideas on ourselves. But really always think about what's your purpose, what are the people, where does it align with your purpose, and what's the process that you have in mind. So intentionality, preparation work, and creating tailored things. Verena, what do you think? Maybe you've got a simpler answer.
Yeah, I very much agree, but I think I have also 3 short points. The one is that it always helped me to never take things for granted. Things can also work otherwise. Like, just because, Congress works the way we might perceive Congress working doesn't mean that we cannot incubate a let's say embryonic new type of Congress on the side of it. And this was the idea of the COSAC as the meeting space for national parliamentarians. Like, it's perfectly okay, because this was designed some decades ago following the French ministerial model that had a very clear vertical idea of organizing public governance questions. Fair enough. But at the same time, this doesn't mean that on the side, we can't try something new. And the second point are just 3 letters, like always ask the question why. And the question why is really the start and the final line of everything, because so many of these processes are sloppy about that question. And my last point and my observation is that we had the Apollo mission, we had the moon mission in the 1960s. And at the same time, it seems that everyone knows that the moon mission was only successful because of NASA. So NASA was the main knowledge enterprise and the main sort of decentralized community of research and practice, of rapid prototyping, of dissenting, of questioning, and so on, of testing everything that was coming with the idea of the putting man to moon. When Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, presented the European Green Deal, which she called Europe's man to moon moment, she implied that this could really, unleash a wave of innovation and fresh spirits in the EU. And somebody rightly said, well, but where is NASA? And so if we understand that we need to turn our economies and our societies upside down in the coming decades in order to achieve net zero and to regenerate our nature, then we also need a kind of NASA, maybe decentralized, and at the same time, a transitional facility or mechanism that helps not just our societies, but also our institutions of democracy to go from one track to the other track, because we are moving a whole society from one moving train to another moving train, and somebody has to organize that. And this is what I call transition diplomacy.
Thank you very much.
Elise, can I come back after Verena said that? I agree, and I want to, yes, I've decided what my one advice is, and it's treat people how you would like to be treated. Many people say know your audience. We say love your audience. Put them, the people, at the center of what you're designing. And if all else fails, you can always call a process designer.
Thank you, Chiara. Thank you, Verena. You created Agora European Green Deal because you believe in the need to have many such safe spaces. It's time to wrap up. We had a lot of insights, which we'll be able to share. We'll be able to share the slides. Remember that in the handbook, we have some of the key ingredients behind many such cases, as illustrated, for instance, with this slide. So the book, again, is open access. You're welcome to access it for free online, and you can find it here. We'll have other such webinars after the summer. The next one will be on participatory philanthropy. So another promising conversation. How do you, exactly as Chiara was saying, if you love your grantees, how do you, instead of thinking for them, involve them in the design of the grants and the grant-making policy? An important topic. So these principles of collective intelligence that are common to all these different aspects we'll continue exploring. So thank you very much, Chiara. Thank you very much, Verena, A, for what you contributed today, B, for everything you're doing. Thank you to my colleagues. Thank you to everyone in the room still with us. And have a good summer and have a good evening.